Hello. Okay. One of my favourite bullet points actually is minority influence, which is what we're looking at today. There's a lot to it, a lot of terms that you do need to know. AO2 is going to be particularly important for this bullet point if the slide ever starts. So let's start by having a look at minority influence. So essentially, what we are talking about when we talk about minority influence is how a small group of people can influence a much, much larger group of people. So why are you not working? So that is the spec on the left-hand side. Minority influence, including reference to consistency, commitment, and flexibility. And the picture on the right-hand side is a film called 12 Angry Men. It is one of the best films of all time. It is basically a jury of 12 people who are deliberating on whether a black man raped and killed a white woman. Set many years ago, many decades ago. And all it is basically 11 of the 12 thinking that the man is guilty straight away. But one person, the hero of the film, Henry Fonda, basically doesn't believe that he is guilty. And slowly, despite the fact he's having loads of people shouting at him, he stands his ground and slowly starts to convince people over to his viewpoint. And that's called minority influence. And that is also what ruining a film ending is called as well for a lot of people. If you're going to watch 12 Angry Men, it's a great film, by the way. So a lot of terms to know, and there are some terms on the left-hand side: conversion, flexibility, augmentation principle, diachronic consistency, synchronic consistency. And on the right-hand side, obviously, we have a couple of presumably suffragettes, not suffragists. I don't know why I'm presuming that. They could be either. And this is basically what we are talking about. A minority group of people who are trying to get their view over to the majority, which is established. And we're looking at how that happens. So as I said, it's the concept that an individual or a small group of people can influence wider society. The process is thought to occur over a long period of time, then majority influence, which tends to be instantaneous. So minority influence does take a long time. And this is called conversion. So conversion is literally the concept that change from a small group of people takes quite a long time. Whereas if you look at Ash, the change happened almost instantaneously. So majority influence is very quick. Minority influence is very, very slow. But not only do you have to know that, you really do have to understand why as well. So a couple of examples, but before we go into this, let's start with the AO1. Now, you need to understand how consistency, commitment, and flexibility influence the majority of people. And you need to understand what we mean by this as well. So if we have a look, whoops, I've just accidentally wiped my face off. If we're back, if we have a look, consistency, commitment, flexibility. Consistency is basically to what extent is the minority's message consistent? To what extent do they say the same thing and agree on the same thing? If they do agree on the same thing, if they are saying the same thing, that is going to influence the majority. So, for example, if the message stays consistent after abuse and social pressures, the majority will possibly start paying attention. Good example here is vegans, for example. Now, vegans are consistent in their message. You have all vegans that say no eggs, no cheese, no meat, no good stuff, no good food, basically, and all vegans say that. It's not as if you have a small group of vegans that go, no, you can eat beef, no, you can eat eggs and cheese, no, you can. Right? They are consistent across time and across the group. And we'll get on to more of that in a second. So why is consistency so important? Why is it a pretty crucial element to this? I've asked the slides to change, and so I'm just going to try delaying what I am talking about here in order to, there we go. I've gone too far, damn it. So this is why, and this is pretty much copied straight off the interweb nets, but consistency may be important because confronted with a consistent opposition, members of the majority will sit up, take notice, and maybe rethink their position. Consistency gives the impression that the minority are convinced they are right. So there is confidence that they are right. And if somebody is so convinced of something that they refuse to waver their opinion, that makes you think maybe I'm wrong. When the majority is confronted with someone with self-confidence and dedication to take a popular stand, they may assume that he or she has a point, and more on that in a second. And a consistent minority disrupts established norms and creates doubt, which can lead to the majority taking the minority very seriously. So, one, you need to know that and understand that. Two, you need to be able to apply this to any change that's happened. Suffragettes, civil rights, gay rights, for example, fracking. You need to be able to, or vegans, for example, you need to be able to apply this. So that's why consistency is quite important. But another one is commitment. How committed are you to your goal? So one of the things I am going to do in the lesson is I'm actually going to, at some point, probably ask you what your cause is. What do you want to fight for? What are you passionate about? What do you care about, for example? What is your cause? And then I'm going to ask you how committed you are to that cause. So and let me just ask you in video land now, what causes would you fight for? To the point where you could get a criminal record, you could be arrested, you could be heavily injured or even killed, for example. What are you committed to? And this is where we have to talk about the augmentation principle. The augmentation principle is this idea that a small group of the minority, so a small group within a small group, are always going to be willing to take greater risks that are self-sacrificial, may get them in trouble, but at the end of the day, they raise awareness. And there are countless examples of this throughout history. So that's what we mean by the augmentation principle. You need to be able to link commitment to the augmentation principle. And finally, you've got flexibility. Now, before I even go into this, students get confused between consistency and flexibility. How can you be consistent and flexible at the same time? So if the minority group is seen as flexible in their message, they will be seen as a reasonable group. You can be consistent, but appear to be listening to the majority. If you're going, let's say you're vegan, for example, and you're being consistent and you're going, no meat, no meat, no meat. What happens if you are absolutely not even listening to meat eaters, for example? The established majority, and you're there going, no meat, no meat, no eggs, no chicken, nothing, no, la 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 la. You're not going to be taken seriously. You're not going to be taken seriously. You're not going to be given the time of day. You're not going to be listened to. So flexibility is quite important. You need to be able to show consistency, but also a willingness to listen to the established majority, and be able to possibly compromise and meet halfway. Religion is not particularly flexible, and this is not me being anti-religious. I'm just picking an example. And this is why science and religion clashes quite a bit, because religion generally is seen as quite inflexible. That is what happened. That is what happened. That is what happened. But they're not particularly. It's not particularly the most flexible kind of institutions or beliefs. I think I can't give examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are them. So, and again, that's not me being anti-religious. So, if the consistent minority are seen as inflexible, uncompromising, they're unlikely going to be taken seriously, and they're probably going to be seen as quite an extreme view, which people aren't obviously going to listen to. So flexibility is actually, consistency is measured by Moscovici. We'll come to that in a second. Flexibility was actually investigated by Nemeth. They had an experiment based on a mock jury. A mock jury is just like a fake jury, basically, in which groups of 3 participants and 1 Confederate, who is posing as a participant, had to decide on the amount of compensation to be given to the victim of a ski lift accident. When the consistent minority, who was the Confederate, argued for a very, very low amount and absolutely refused to change his position, which gave them, £100, £100, £100. Well, we should give them more. No, £100, £100. When he refused, that had no effect on the majority whatsoever. However, when he compromised and met them halfway, the majority also compromised. So it does show that it can be beneficial to be flexible in your role. So vegans, they need to accept that some people do eat meat, and they're not necessarily going to convince everybody. Maybe a compromise would be to, I don't know, get off red meat rather than white meat. Red meat is generally, I think it's generally worse for the environment and worse for health and bigger animals and stuff. I don't know. But that might be a compromise that vegans have to, and I'm not being funny, but if a vegan's going, no meat, no cheese, no eggs, I'm not going to take that actually that seriously compared to somebody who compromises and meets us halfway in this message. So, another term. When we're talking about consistency, I just want to go back to consistency a little bit. There's 2 types of consistency you need to know. Synchronic consistency is a consistency between members of the group. So everybody agrees within the group. There is a consistent opinion. Whereas diachronic consistency is you've had a consistency over a long period of time. So vegans now are saying the same as what they were 5, 10, 15 years ago, for example. So you do need to know the difference and be able to give examples of this. Okay. Just one final note before we go into some AO2 type examples. It doesn't literally have to be a numerical majority we're talking about. When we talk about minority, women were once a minority. Women, back, even though they were numerically not a minority, there was 50-50 men and women, they were considered a minority. So I don't want you to, the reason why I'm saying this, I don't want you to think of like minority as how many people are in there, like you grow the minority. When we're talking about growing the minority, we're talking about growing the acceptance of the minority, not simply the amount of people that are in that group. So for example, no, I'm not going to go to that example. Some examples here that you do need to know about. Now, what I would do is I would take one of these 8 examples and I would know them in a bit of detail, what's happened, who, what events have happened. So, for example, the 4th one down, civil rights, know about the Selma marches, know about Rosa Parks, for example, know about what Martin Luther King did, so on and so forth. Homosexuality, bisexuality, know about Alan Turing, for example, know about some of the protests that happened over the fact that gay people and people of the LGBTQ community couldn't get married and stuff, right? So, so know about the real life events. That's really important, by the way. So let's go into minority influence. Well, no, there's no point really. I've kind of gone into that. The snowball effect is quite obvious. I think I've actually got the snowball effect just here. It's the idea, and I'm not going to go into this too much, but it's the idea that through consistency, commitment, flexibility, an augmentation principle, diachronic consistency, synchronic consistency, people are convinced very slowly, and that's called a snowball effect. And numbers grow very slowly. They slowly multiply, and therefore you get strength in numbers that way. So in terms of evaluations, now this is quite important because before you didn't actually have to really evaluate it, but they've started asking questions which they're going to test you a little bit. These theories allow us to encourage the growth of minorities that will help society. That's really crucial, by the way. We now know how to grow acceptable minorities and how to maybe get rid of maybe socially unacceptable minorities. I don't want to name any just in case. So, for example, okay, I've got one off the top of my head. Incel. The incel movement is a minority movement of a small group of mainly misogynistic men, twats we like to call them, that incel stands for involuntary celibate. It's a movement that was actually created by a woman. It's quite big in Canada, but it's kind of morphed into this thing where men take their anger out on women for refusing to have sexual relationships with them. There was an incel movement in Plymouth in Britain quite recently, and I think 6 people were killed. That's a minority. It's trying to gain traction by attracting new members. We now know how to kill that movement because we now know the mechanisms by which a minority becomes accepted. On the flip side, if there is, and it says here, for example, social enterprises. A social enterprise is basically a business or a movement that is generally seen as quite good for society. We can encourage the growth of these businesses and these movements. Another evaluation is the link between commitment and the augmentation principle makes sense. That has face validity, doesn't it? We see this so often. We see people sacrifice themselves for their cause. The classic example, the absolute classic example here is if I type in, I'm just going to type in, I'm going to take a, no, I'm not going to take a shot here, but if I can't remember the name. I think it's Thich Quang Duc. Was a Tibetan monk. Oh, the internet's going to die on me now. Thich Quang Duc was a Tibetan monk who basically, if I type in photo, typed in Tibetan wrong there as well. That's not what I was trying to. Right. Okay. Admittedly, when I typed in Tibetan monk photo, for some reason I didn't expect to get loads of photos of Tibetan monks. Okay, let's try that one again. If I type in Tibetan monk fire, there we go. This is one of the most famous photos of the 20th century. I think it was actually the most famous photo of the 20th century. It says rare historical photos. This is not a rare photo at all. This is a very commonly known photo. 1963. This is Thich Quang Duc setting himself on fire and obviously killing himself in protest of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. This is, I think we can argue, extremely self-sacrificial. And it kind of, and again, it's another example I'd want you to use. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? This idea, a small group of people are willing to take great risks. I'm going to go on a limb here and say, no Tibetan monk wanted to be invaded by China. Right? I'm just going to go on a limb. I'm just going to guess that most of them wanted to remain independent. Yet only one was willing to actually set himself on fire. It's the augmentation principle. We see it all the frigging time. So it has face validity. It does make sense. Yes, you can. What else? As I said, there's loads of real world examples. Veganism is the classic example here, and there's a link to vegan restaurants just to show you how commonplace they are nowadays. And Moscovici also backs this up as well. So quite an important evaluation there. I've got a model pill there, which I'll just put my face up there. I'm not going to read this out because I'm a bit wary of time, but because I've got something else I want to do. So I want to go through this. And I want to go through Moscovici. Now, I don't want to go through Moscovici in a lot of detail. I'm just going to hit... Moscovici is not named in the spec. However, it is a really, really useful piece of research to know all the way through. So there is an aim there. There is an aim there. He wants to create conflict within the majority. So he kind of did Ash, but round the opposite way. He had all female participants who were not colorblind. That's important. And he had a control group, etc., etc. Fine. All groups were shown 36 slides, and all the slides were blue, basically, right? All the slides were some sort of blue, right? All different shades, different intensities. And they were asked to state the color out loud. They were lied to that it was a color perception test. Fine. Okay. Easy. There were two groups. So basically, in a group, you had 4 actual participants and 2 Confederates in on the study. So the Confederates, in this case, unlike Ash, the Confederates were the minority. So you had consistent Confederates who would constantly say green, not red. They would say green, 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 green. And you had inconsistent where 24 times they said green, 12 times they said blue. But remember, all of the slides were actually shades of blue. That is a control finding. Control group, by the way, the control group was they had no minority in the group. It was just 4 normal people, 4 actual participants. If it was inconsistent, it was 1.25, but if it was consistent, it did raise to 8.42, showing, and again, you may want to go through and read these slides a bit more to actually gain understanding of this, but showing a consistent minority influences the majority quicker and more effectively than an inconsistent minority. Worth having a look through that. So, I think in your questions, you're going to need to know AO2 here quite a bit. You're going to need to know AO2. Fun. This question came up in a recent paper. Fewer and fewer people use single-use plastic items, such as water bottles and... I've just realised this is actually the wrong bullet point. I'm going to give you an example here. This is not quite the bullet point. This is for the next bullet point, but I do want to go through this one and then I'll go through it in a bit more detail. Fewer and fewer people use single-use plastic items such as water bottles and plastic straws. Using your knowledge of social change processes in social change, which minority influence is one, explain why fewer and fewer people are going to be using single-use plastic. So some of this answer I'm about to show you is actually not relevant to what we are talking about here. But I want to see if I can actually find something just here. Here we go. As environmental concerns and education about damage caused by plastic increase, people may slowly use less plastic as they believe it's the right thing to do. Fine. This process has been slow due to the snowball effect, whereby people are slow to realize how bad the situation is. And additionally, minority influence processes affect the rate of plastic usage. For example, and here is augmentation principle. For example, a small group of the minority will take self-sacrificial actions to get the message across of plastic usage. For example, stealing all plastic straws from restaurants and burning them. That is the tough skill from this bullet point. It's not you knowing consistency, commitment, flexibility. It's you being able to apply them to a situation effectively. That is by far and away the most important skill you're going to have to know for this bullet point. Hope that was useful. A lot of terms. And make sure you look at the exam questions for this because it's really, really heavily AO2. Thank you very much. Peace out.